Shalom everyone. We are continuing Sefer melachim and melachim Beis, and we're up to Perek Tes Zayin, and we are currently again melachim zigzags back and forth between Malchus Yehuda and Malchus Yisrael, and now we are focusing on Malchus Yehuda, and we are told that in the 17th year of the reign of Pekach ben Ramalyahu, Malach Ochaz ben Yasam Melech Yehuda. So now we have Ochaz. Ochaz is the king of Yehuda. Ben Esrim Shana Ochaz b'Malchai. Ochaz was 20 years old. V'Sheshes Shana Melech b'Shlam. He reigned for 16 years. And here, unfortunately, although his father was righteous and his grandfather was righteous, Ochaz himself was a Rasha. Loi Asa Hayashar B'Einei Hashem Elokav K'David Aviv. He did not follow in the ways of David, his ancestor. Vayelech b'derech Malcha Yisrael, and in point of fact, he followed the same rishus as Malcha Yisrael, and even worse, v'gam es b'nai hever ba'esh. He practiced the melach avodah. Melach, which the Torah prohibits, is a form of avodah zarah, where you set up a bonfire on two sides, and your son walks through. Maybe he survives, maybe he doesn't. And the Torah says, in addition to stam avodah zarah, there's a special condemnation of Melach, and Ochaz even did this to his own children. Ketaya v'is hagoyim, like the abominations of the very nations that Hashem kicked out to give to Bnei Yisrael, the tayavos of the 7 nations, Asher harish Hashem osam mibnei Bnei Yisrael, v'yizabeach v'yikater b'bamais. Now this does not mean the bamas for Hashem. This means bamas for Avodah Zarah. And he brought korbanos and incense on altars for idolatry, guvaos on the hills, tachas kolei tzranan under the trees, which was again a way of Avodah Zarah worship with Asherah, Avodah Zarah trees. And as we said already in the years of his father Yosam, Ritzin, the king of Aram, and Pekach ben Ramalyahu Melech Yisrael are joining forces against Malchus Yehuda. And this, we were not given any details before, but now we're discussing it in the reign of Ochaz. Oz Yala Ritzin Melech Aram, Upekach ben Ramalyahu Melech Yisrael Yerushalayim l'Milchama, Vayatsuru al Ochaz. And they made a siege, they surrounded Yerushalayim to besiege the city. V'lo yachlu lihilachem, they were not able to fight. Now, I just want to point out, we had mentioned before that one of the earlier Malcha Yisrael had actually made a breach in the wall 400 amais, so the city was open at that point. Our assumption has to be that the breach was repaired, and as a result, at this time, it is a fully surrounded city that can only be besieged. And, Boisahi, Heishiv Ritzin Melech Aram es Eilat li Aram, that Ritzin took back, well, they took it from us, but Ritzin, the king of Aram, retook Eilat, which had been recaptured by Malchus Yehuda. Vayenashel es Yehudim me'elot, he threw away, he didn't put them into exile, but he evacuated them from their homes. V'yadumim bo'elat, and it was repopulated by Edomites, Bnei Esav, v'yeshvu sham ad hayom hazeh. That is why, even afterwards, Edom remained in possession of Eilat. So now, Ochaz does something that proves to be a very wrong move. Ochaz is being besieged by Syria and by Malchus Yisrael. Ochaz needs help. He's not strong enough to fight them. So who is stronger than Aram and Malchus Yisrael? Assyria. The king right now is Tiglath-Pileser. He had already exiled from the northern kingdom Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, you need to understand a little bit of an orientation here. I mean, you might think, hey, the guy exiled Jews. How could I, as a Jew, seek his help? But you have to understand that from a political perspective, these kings were not viewing themselves as Yidden. They were not viewing themselves as Klal Yisrael. Malchus Yisrael was regarded as a hostile enemy of Malchus Yehuda. And Mimela, since Ashur has already been willing to do bad things to Malchus Yisrael, so Achaz thinks that he could enlist the assistance of Tiglath-Pileser to ward off the threat from Ritzin and from Pekach ben Ramalyo. Vayishlach Achaz malachim el Tiglath-Pileser melech Ashur lemar, Avdecha ubincha ani. I am your slave, I am your son, min banim avadim. I will be like a son to you, I will be like a slave to you, whatever you want me to be. Alei v'hoshieni, come and save me. Mikaf melech Aram, from the hand of melech Aram, and mikaf melech Yisrael, and from the hand of the melech Yisrael, come in malai. Vayikach Achaz. So once again, Achaz took, at every few kings this is done, whatever kesev and zav, which are nimsa bebeis Hashem in the Beis Hamikdash, Asher says Hamelech, vayishlach lemelech Asher sheichat. So he sent a sheichat of all of the wealth in the Mikdash, which is vaday keneged halacha, it's kadesh, and all of the Beis Hamelech's wealth, which he could do with what he wants with. Vayishma elav. Remember, Ashur has a proclivity to accepting bribes. We had this before. The Melech Ashur heard. Vayal Melech Ashur el Damasek, and Assyria went to Damascus, Yitvasah, conquered it. And once again, as I said before, Ashur invented exile as a military technique. Vayagleha Kira, he sent the inhabitants, he transposed populations. He sent the populations of Damasek to the city of Kir, and he brought the people of Kir to Damasek. Es Ritzin Hamas, he killed the king of Syria, Ritzin. So Baruch Hashem, he didn't do anything to the 10 tribes, but he got rid of Ritzin. Vayelech hamelech Achaz likros Tiglath-Pileser melech Ashur Damasek, and Achaz took a trip to Damascus to honor, to greet Tiglath-Pileser from Ashur, who had conquered Damascus. And now, a very interesting curiosity. Vayar es hamizbeach asher b'Damasek. Achaz, who is a Rasha, saw a beautiful altar for Avodah Zarah that was in Damasek. Now, whether that's from Aram or from Ashur, I don't know, but this was the big mizbeach in Damasek. Vayishlach hamelech Achaz el Uriah HaKohen. So Achaz the Melech sent to Uriah, who is presumably the Kohen Gadol of the then, because there's a Beis Hamikdash, Estemus HaMizbeach v'es Tavniso l'chol Maseyo. He sent him a diagram of this Mizbeach, telling him, I want this Mizbeach to be in the Beis Hamikdash. And suffice it to say, number one, there already is a Mizbeach in the Beis Hamikdash, Mizbeach Avanim, that dates from the time of Shlomo HaMelech. Remember, the Mizbeach HaNecheshes of Moshe was Nignaz. That was not used in the first Beis Hamikdash. This is a new big Mizbeach of Avanim, of smooth stones that were not cut with barzel. But the king, Achaz, likes the Mizbeach in Damasek. And the Pasuk says, Vayiven Uriah HaKohen es HaMizbeach. Uriah HaKohen goes along with the king, he builds a Mizbeach. Kechayel asher shalach hamelach Achaz midamasek, in accordance with all of these specifications that the king had sent from Damascus. Kain asa Uriah HaKohen ad bo hamelech Achaz midamasek. And all of this was completed before the king even got back from Damascus. Vayavay hamelech midamasek, the king returned to Yerushalayim from Damascus. Vayara melech as mizbeach, and the king saw the mizbeach. Vayakrev hamelech al mizbeach v'yal olav, he brought korbanos on the mizbeach. So again, this is a little ambiguous. On one level, this mizbeach was put in the Beis Hamikdash, which was totally asur. But it's not clear what is Achaz doing. Is Achaz sacrificing to Avodah Zarah? Which makes it not only Avodah Zarah, but in the Mikdash itself? Or is Achaz sacrificing to Hashem, but he likes his Mizbeach better, which is also an Avera, because that doesn't have Kedushas HaMizbeach. It's not on the Makam HaMizbeach. So there's a machlekes exactly what he's doing, but it says he's bringing sacrifices on this new Mizbeach. V'yakter esay das minchasay, the burnt offerings, the mincha offerings, v'yasech es niskai, the wine libations, v'yizrak estam hashlamim asherlai, which implies a korban for Hashem, actually, that the zerika sadam was on the mizbech. First of all, it also it's mashma that he's doing it, not the kaihanim. That itself will make it pasul as well. So there are a lot of different averis. So what about the real mizbeach? So here it says, v'yes HaMizbach HaNechayshes Asher Lifnei Hashem, with respect to the copper Mizbeach that is in the Beis HaMikdash. So, first of all, Rashi does point out that this should not be understood literally. It is true that the Mizbeach of Moshe Rabbeinu in the Mishkan is called the Mizbeach HaNechayshes because it actually, it was hollow. They would carry it hollow, but it was plated with copper plates. It was hollow, and then they would fill it up with dirt when they would position it with the Mishkan. So the outer Mizbeach of Korbanais goes by the name Mizbeach HaNechayshes, or grammatically, Mizbach HaNechayshes. Right? We say Mizbeach HaNechayshes, but Mizbach HaNechayshes. But Rashi points out that that is a misnomer, because in point of fact, the Mizbach HaNechayshes that Moshe Rabbeinu made, actually B'Tzalel made, as I said before, was not used in the Beis HaMikdash at all. It was Nignaz. Number one, it was too small, and number two, L'Dairas, the Mizbeach is supposed to be Avonim, not Nechayshes. And it was replaced by a much larger Mizbeach of Avonim. However, since the outer Mizbeach was known by the older term Mizbach HaNechayshes, so even the stone Mizbeach of Shlomo got that name. So it's a little confusing. It is not a Mizbeach HaNechayshes, but we call it Mizbeach HaNechayshes. And the pasuk therefore says, V'yeis Mizbach HaNechayshes Lifnei Hashem. What about the real Mizbeach? V'yakrev Me'eis Pnei Abayas Mibein HaMizbeach U'mibein Beis Hashem. So it's a very crazy situation. You have the real Mizbeach, and he moved in his own Mizbeach directly to the north of the real Mizbeach, but closer to the Heichal, as if to say he's elevating it, meaning to say you have the Mizbeach in front of the Heichal, and he put his Mizbeach, not blocking it, he didn't put it directly in front, there actually wouldn't have been room, he put it to the north, but he positioned it closer to the Heichal of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to give it an elevated status. Meaning he put it between the Mizbeach and the Beis Hashem, but he put it to the north. So it was not directly in front of it. Vayitzaveh hamelech Achaz es Uriah Kohen Lemor, and King Achaz commanded Uriah the Kohen, Al mizbeach hagadol haktiras olas haboker es minchas ha'erev v'es olas hamelech v'es minchaso v'es olas kol ha'ma'aretz minchaso v'niskayim v'chol dam ha'olah v'chol dam zevach olav tizrei. So here, this is clearly that Achaz is now saying, I want all the karbanos to be brought on my big altar. The korban tamid of the morning and the korban tamid of the afternoon, and the special karbanos that a melech brings, and the meal offerings that a melech brings, and the olos of everybody who brings karbanos with their mincha, with their meal offerings, and with their wine libations. And all of the blood of the karbanos must be thrown, must be nizrak, on my Mizbeach. Mizbach HaNechayshes. And what about the real Mizbeach? Ye'ali levaker. It belongs to me to occasionally bring korbanos there. Meaning to say, it's not even for the public anymore. I will keep it as my private auxiliary Mizbeach. So this is Bechlal, a legamri bizayin. And yet, Uriah follows everything. Vayas Uriah HaKayin K'chayel Asher Tziva Melech Achaz. So this has to mean that all the Kohanim are complicit in this Aveira. Furthermore, Vayikatzeitz HaMelech Achaz Es HaMiskaros HaMechonos V'yasar Me'aleim Es HaKior V'esayam Harid Me'al HaBokar Nechesh Asher Tachteha Vayitein Oisai Al Mirtzefes HaAvonim. So here, you have to remember a little bit the very complicated blueprints, descriptions that we had in the book of Melachim Aleph about the Binyan Beis HaMikdash. And you'll recall that Shlomo HaMelech made 10 wagons upon which there were kiors, because there were so many Kohanim. So instead of just one kior, he had the one major kior, but then he had all sorts of smaller kioros on top of wagons with wheels that were positioned north of the Mizbeach. Now, since Ochaz needs all of that room for his Mizbeach, what he did was he disassembled all of the wagons and he moved them into a place where they weren't taking up the room. And similarly, Shlomo had a huge basin, not the kior. This was literally the size of a big mikveh, called the Yam Shel Shlomo, and it was resting on top of statues of Bakar, which took up a lot of room. He removed the Yam Shel Shlomo from the Bakar of Necheshes. The Yam was gold and the Bakar were Necheshes, again, to clear out the site to make room. Again, without a picture, it's a little hard to visualize, but you understand the general idea. He's putting in this gigantic Mizbeach to the north of the old Mizbeach. He has to clear the room of all the stuff that's to the north, and that is primarily the wagons for the Kior and the Yam Shel Shlomo, and he put the actual basin of water, the Yam of Shlomo, on Martzefes Avanim on the stone floor. Other things he disassembled. V'yes, Mosach HaShabbos Asher Banu B'bayis. So Mosach HaShabbos was simply like an awning, meaning to say, since all of the Aveda was on the outside, open air basically, except for the Ketairos and the Menorah, the Karbanos are all brought in the Azorah, so there was kind of an awning to protect people from the sun, but this was only put up on Shabbos, and the reason is because when Kohanim are doing the Aveda, so the awning from the side is not going to protect them because they're in the middle. But on Shabbos, you have the new Mishmor that is arriving, and they're waiting for their service, because they're not going to be doing service till the afternoon. So if they arrive, they can remain in the Azorah covered by a shelter. So that's why it's called Maisach HaShabbos, the awning or the covering or the sukkah for Shabbos. And he disassembled that. Now here it's not entirely clear what the point was. Was that also removed to make room for this big Mizbeach? Perhaps so. And the final thing that he did was, Es mavo ha-melech ha-chitzayna heisev beis Hashem b'bnei melech Ashur. That the king made himself a private road, or a private tunnel, to go from his palace to the Mikdash, so he wouldn't have to expose himself to the public. In other words, he wanted to be able to enter the Mikdash, or enter the Azorah, without going through actual crowds or encountering people. This was a private path. Now it mentions Mipnei Melech Ashur. It's not clear why would this be because of Melech Ashur. Maybe he wants to avoid his own people, but apparently he was afraid that Melech Ashur might try to assassinate him. Yes, he bribed Melech Ashur, but maybe the Melech Ashur will get greedy, and he felt his life was at risk. So when he would go to the Mikdash, he wanted to go in a way that he had his own private tunnel. So this is the reign of Achaz. V'yeser divrei Achaz asher asa, all the other deeds of Achaz, haloim kesuvim, they are written in the book Divrei Hayam Malchei Yehuda, which again may be our Divrei Hayam, or it may be a totally secular book, like Malchei Yisrael, that we don't have. Vayishkav Achaz im avaisav, vayikaver im avaisav bir David. And now the king who succeeds Achaz is one of the greatest tzaddikim of Malchei Yehuda, amazingly enough. Yimleich Chizkiyahu b'nai Tachtav, that Chizkiyahu HaMelech now becomes king. Chazal actually tell us Chizkiyahu was roy to be Mashiach, and we will discuss Chizkiyahu at great length. But for the next prakim, we now segue back to Malchei Yisrael to discuss the exile of the 10 tribes.